Uganda at an organization with a long name, African Center for Global Health and Social Transformation, but in short, we just say ACHEST. And as of last week, I was elected the Vice President of the African Forum for Research and Education in Health. So I'm really delighted that you could join us. You are all very welcome to this webinar. And it is the first of its kind because it is being organized by the Health Professional Education Research Technical Working Group. We have several working groups in AFREhealth, and this is the most active, so it's the one that has put up this webinar. So you are all very welcome. I would like to introduce our speaker today. If I was to give the CV of Susan, I would take an hour. So I won't do that because it was sent to you. Susan has a very heavy CV, but I would like to say she's the director of the health workforce. Sorry, she's the director and she's a director and professor at the Center for Health Professions Education, Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Stellenbosch University, Cape Town. Susan, you are very welcome. And she's until recently been the leader of this technical working group. And she has gladly handed it over to Dr. Roy Mubuke from Makerere University. Roy, you are also welcome. He's also on this webinar. I would like to welcome everybody from all over the world. We have participants from all over the world. Thank you so much for joining us. And for questions, please, and comments, put them in the chat box. We'll keep an eye on the chat box and we'll try as much as possible to answer them. Because of limitation of time, those that will not be able to answer, we have a blog on the AFREhealth website. We'll be able to answer them from there. Susan will be able to answer them and respond to your comments from there. So over to you, Susan.
Right, thanks, Elsie. Really great to be here. If you can just confirm, Elsie, that you can hear me and that you can see the screen, then we're good to go.
Yes, we can hear you very well and we can see your beautiful face as well.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I managed to have my hair cut. For a long time here in South Africa, we weren't even allowed to have our hair cut. So yeah, it's wonderful to be here. And I need to tell everyone that it's so amazing that Mbuki's leading the Health Professions Education Research SIG for AFREhealth. I had the privilege of being one of Mbuki's supervisors for his PhD, and yeah, just wonderful to see how that is up and running. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank AFREhealth. Clara is just the most amazing human being. She keeps the administrative things going in such a fantastic way. Iranius, for all your help. And then Elsie and Mariki, my longtime dear colleagues, and I hope I can call them dear friends as well. So thanks everyone. It's really great. And today we're going to be talking about transformative learning theory and hopefully some implications that this theory holds for our practice. I'm hoping to get this done in about 30 minutes so that we have a good amount of time for questions afterwards. As Elsie said, she's going to be keeping an eye on the chat, so I'm just going to be managing my text and the slides, but Elsie will keep an eye on the chat so that we can address those questions later. Elsie mentioned that I come from South Africa. I'm situated at Stellenbosch University, and I'm really very fortunate to work there with a small group, but a wonderfully enthusiastic group of health professions educationalists. So yeah, that's me. Any webinar like this, see if this is working. There we go. Right, so I need to acknowledge a few people. What I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from quite a big body of work that's been done with 2 different groups over quite a period of time. So a lot of what I'll be sharing in the first part comes from the scoping review that I conducted with a group of colleagues from the Bellagio Global Health Education Initiative, and you see their names listed there. And then more recently at the AME conference last year, we ran a symposium on transformative learning, and their colleagues, David Davies, Ayelet Cooper, Tina Martimianakis, and Janine Greenhill. So I share this work on their behalf as well. So what is this webinar all about? Well, I want to do 3 things. We want to talk about transformative learning theory and just place it on the spotlight and just find out what is this theory all about. And we want to talk a little bit about how it might manifest in our classroom and in the clinical learning space. And then I'm going to close with some caveats and concerns. I'm going to put some questions to you for you guys to think about and to perhaps work with in your own context. So what does this mean for health professions education? And obviously I've had to make a couple of choices today. I didn't know exactly who will be on this webinar. I don't know what your background is, what your context is. So I've taken a bit of the middle of the road sort of approach. For those who are looking for more in-depth theoretical engagement with transformative learning theory, send me an email. I can send you lots of information. And for others for whom this is brand new, I hope we don't run too quickly, that we all stay together. So where's this all come from? Well, transformative learning theory, well, as a theoretical construct, was introduced through the formative work of Jack Meserov. And his original inspiration actually came from the women's liberation movement in the United States at the time. And what was important for Meserov was that we develop a consciousness and an awareness of the conditions that are causing societal and personal suppression, in this case of women. And focus very strongly on the cognitive processes that come to understand the way in which power is hidden, the way it works towards suppression. And Meserov regarded this sort of critical engagement, this awareness, as a necessary condition for intentionally working towards liberation and empowerment. So immediately you can hear that this theory right from the start was premised on issues of social justice. And I declare at the start of this webinar, that's the point of departure, the entry point that I bring into this theory. Meserov's ideas came from Kuhn's conceptions of paradigms. He drew on Paulo Freire's work, of course, around critical consciousness, and Habermas's domains of learning. So it was a theoretically very rich theory that he was pulling together here. But since Meserov, and indeed Meserov himself, started engaging with transformative learning theory in a more higher education perspective, and you can see the list of names there on the screen of others who have debate. And more recently become more active in health professions education. So I offer you a definition from Meserov, but of course many others have sort of redefined and reframed and reimagined transformative learning theory. But let's go back to the original. Transformative learning is learning that transforms problematic frames of references. And the way in which he saw problematic frames of reference were sets of fixed assumptions and expectations. So your habits of mind, your beliefs, your worldviews. And the intention of this sort of learning is to make those ideas more inclusive, more discriminating, and not in a discriminatory way, but what Meserov was meaning there is more discerning in a sense, asking questions, open, reflection, an important component of this theory, and emotionally able to change. And so you see there this idea of reflection where the critical or premise was deeply intertwined into this definition. Now, in 2008, Kitchenham started, there was actually a big systematic review looking at transformative learning theory in about 2006. And following on that, Kitchenham suggested that it was, as a discourse, it was a uniquely adult form of metacognition reasoning. That's how it was framed, how people were starting to see transformative learning theory. So remembering that it moved from this sort of women's movement several years before. So they argued that its epistemology is situated in this adult form of metacognitive reasoning, and this reasoning was the process of advancing and assessing reasons, especially those that provide arguments supporting beliefs resulting in decisions to act. Now, all those words really are saying the things that make us do what we do. And so transformative learning argues that we should consciously, intentionally be thinking about what is driving our actions. And Keegan suggested that this will require a shift from a socialized, in other words, doing what others do, to a self-authoring epistemology. So knowing because one engages intentionally metacognitively and in terms of one's reasoning. So if that's not very clear, stay with me, we're getting there. So transformative learning, suggests Lang, and you can see all these authors are coming from the mid-2000s, is not just an epistemological process. So Keegan had suggested it's a shifted epistemology, but Lang's saying it's not just an epistemological process involving a change in worldview and habits of thinking. So what Meserov had been saying in terms of what we believe, but it's also an ontological process where participants experience a change in their being in the world, including their forms of relatedness. So you can see these two dimensions coming through consistently as sort of a yin and yang of one another. So that if you start thinking critically and self-authorizing the things that you think you know, and that knowing will lead to a different way of being in the world. So now Meserov actually developed a set of 10 steps to inform his theory. Now what's very interesting, if you are familiar with the literature on transformative learning, is that most people get stuck on step number 1. And we often hear and we often read about students having to be exposed to a disorienting dilemma. So a lot of the work that I've done around transformative learning has been in the field of global health, and this idea that, you know, if you place students in a context that is unfamiliar, it disorients them, they become uncertain, and that can challenge them to think differently about others, about context, about society. But Meserov actually had these 10 steps, taking you from the dilemma to the self-examination and a critical assessment. So again, that cognitive, intentional looking at what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing and what I'm being exposed to. So we think in the context of health profession students who are working on a daily basis in the healthcare system, how they examine what they're feeling and critically assess not what they're seeing, but the understandings and the assumptions upon which the practices are built that they are seeing. So there's that additional layer of depth. Moving on to a process of recognition, understanding one's discontent. Why is this a dilemma? Exploring new options for my being. and then taking the full cycle, actually planning a course of action. So it's not just emotive response, but it's a conscious planning of action and a recognition that I might need to learn something that I didn't know, that I might need new skills to try on these new roles. And then in the new roles, building competence and self-confidence that takes us full cycle and reintegrates the way in which we are living our lives. Now, that might seem very theoretical, but how incredible if our students can go through such processes. Indeed, remember that this theory is an adult theory. What about us? And it occurred to me as I was preparing for this webinar that if we think of what we've experienced in the last 5-6 months in the world, a lot of this has been happening. Many of us have had to rethink and critically assess where we are and where we stand. So maybe my challenge back to me is, so how am I planning a future course of action? And what knowledge and skills have I realized that I do not have? And how am I going to build competence and self-confidence for perhaps a new way of being? But why should we as health professions educators be interested? Well, Taylor, who was the author of the 2006, came out in 2007, systematic review relating to transformative learning. Actually, it wasn't a systematic review, it was a narrative review. He called it an iconic educational philosophy of the field. And yet acknowledged a lack of clarity around the concept. So an absence of an immediately understandable definition. And Illerus was arguing that we need to find something that will separate transformative from non-transformative. I'm not sure that I agree with Illerus necessarily, and I think the thing with any meta theory like this is it sort of gets a life of its own. And perhaps some of the things that I believed about transformative learning theory a few years back have indeed changed. So, yeah. But another reason why this was important is because there was a revolution in health professions education in 2010 when Frank and Chen and others brought out that Lancet Commission and were really critiquing the way in which health professions students were being trained and the curricula that were outdated. They posited that we needed to move towards this transformative learning. So from informative and formative, which was what many of us were comfortable with, to this notion of developing leaders, people who will be able to make a change. And in this context, a strongly social justice imperative that's saying we need to change the way in which the healthcare system is playing out across the world. Maybe just to go to my roots, those of you who don't know me, my PhD is actually in higher education and not in health professions education. But this slide is really just to show you that these ideas about learning are also prevalent in the higher education literature. And I just draw your attention to the mauve block on the right, that really talks about a changed sense of identity, someone who sees things differently, recognizing that knowledge is complex, and about making meaning. So these ideas have come away. So we did the scoping review. We felt that the Taylor review that had been conducted in 2006, published 2007, which looked at transformative learning across the entire literature, we decided to focus just on health professions education and really wanted to know how is transformative learning understood in the literature. Now, very briefly, you can read the article. We looked at undergraduate and postgraduate students. We had an interest in rural and global health. We had studies from the countries you can see listed there. We had a large group of included studies, as you can see. 49 empirical and 39 conceptual studies. And this was a challenge with the scoping review to actually engage with conceptual studies as well. But nevertheless, we felt that often these studies gave us an even richer understanding of how people were seeing transformative learning. The range of data collection processes that were used in the included studies, etc., etc. But more importantly, what was the literature saying? The health professions education literature, how were they describing transformative learning? Keeping in mind those complex definitions, keeping in mind Meserov's 10 steps, people said it's about change. So it's change in values, in those frames of reference that define the students, and a change in behavior. They also describe transformative learning as learning that has impact. But that was often not problematized and taken further. It was also often described in terms of critical reflection, so reinterpreting one's experience. The idea of competence and confidence in new roles did emerge in especially the conceptual studies, this idea of the student being a change agent, but it was largely reported by the students and not necessarily evidenced. Transformative learning was seen as embracing dynamic and collaborative cognitive strategies. The ideas of social justice were found in many of the studies, most of which saw transformative learning as situated within a constructivist paradigm. What did the study say? What makes a difference? What can facilitate transformative learning? Well, it was experiencing the dissonance and disruption of preconceived ideas. As I said, many studies seem to stick with that first point. There was a focus on the individual and realizing that the individual would need to critique and consider him or herself. And it was felt that this best happened when there were dedicated supervisors, mentors, facilitators, and having a clear strategy, which for us, looking at from a global health perspective, found really, really interesting, because to what extent can one really structure a very clear strategy for global health experiences? But that was just as an aside. So we argued in our article that transformative learning provides educators with a theoretical lens through which they can view students' learning. So it gives them a frame. I remember presenting on the scoping review to a group of colleagues at Stellenbosch University, and the one woman sat back, she said, "Susan, you've finally given me a theory to explain what I do," which was really great. Subsequent to the publication of our article, Saxena and colleagues came out with a sort of a bit of a follow-up study and suggested that transformative learning provides this theoretical lens by striving to transcend the boundaries between philosophy, the nature of being, and science, and by constructing a tangible bridge using 3 different pillars of ways of knowing. Knowing that, knowing how, and knowing why. And I think Saxena has captured the essence of Meserov's thinking very succinctly for us here, and gives us something tangible to work with. The students know that they know how, but they also know why. So in this last section of the webinar, I want to pose the 3 dilemmas that I mentioned at the start, these caveats and concerns. Because we spent 2.5 years working on the transformative learning theory scoping review. We had to not redo, but we had to extend the review by an additional 6 months, because the process really was very thorough, but also it just really took a long time. We were a large group having to find consensus on things. And subsequent to the publication of the scoping review, when I came to engage with the colleagues for the symposium at AME, we started asking other questions about transformative learning. And these are 3 of the questions that came up in the symposium. The first one is, well, should education be transformative? And you're probably thinking, well, Susan, how can you even ask that? Of course. But hold that idea. And then who should make it happen? So there was a big focus on the individual student. And there was also quite a strong focus in the literature on having the right mentor or teacher or coach or tutor. But we wanted to ask more questions about how that might work. And then ultimately, the question that most people have asked me about transformative learning since I started on this work is, but how do you know if it worked? Because one thing that Mesarov spoke about quite strongly was that this, once you've shifted your thinking, it's like a being thinking that has changed, and you are unlikely to go back to former ways of thinking. And those of you familiar with the work of people like Mayer and Land and their, I've completely lost the word, threshold concepts, there we go. Could just look at my notes. Their work around threshold concepts speaks to something similar when you sort of get to the essence, to the meat of a threshold concept. When that understanding becomes clear, then you don't go back from that. So questions about, well, how will we know if this has worked? So to answer the first question, Jacek, again, last year brought out a very interesting article related to transformative learning and posed 3 quite specific ethical questions. So if we're going to thrust students into disorienting dilemmas, if I think of our senior students who have gone back into the hospitals, they've been back for several weeks now, even when COVID was at its absolute height in our hospitals. That could be, one could argue, was a disorienting dilemma and a potential space for transformative learning. But did the students even agree to this? What happens when we go in a controversial direction? Who's then responsible for guiding the student? Who's going to care for them if there is transformative trauma, as Jacek calls it? And so Tina suggested in the symposium that maybe transformative learning is a dangerous pedagogy. Something to think about, because there's the challenge of the disorienting dilemma. So in work that I'm currently engaged in, we are looking at the philosophical principles that underpin our curricula. We're looking specifically at 2 programs, the medical program and the physiotherapy program. And those programs are all situated on a set of what I call philosophical principles. Some people frame them as graduate attributes. But I would pose the question, well, what does it mean when claims are made about things like social accountability and advocacy? I mean, how are we even understanding these things? We've been engaging with staff who are responsible for enacting curricula. So we often write these ideas into our curricula, but when it comes to the enacting of them, it is the teacher who has to understand the principle and share that with the student. And our early analyses are showing us that often teachers experience tension. How far should I push the students? How far should I challenge them? So often disorienting dilemmas come out of crises, such as we're seeing now with the COVID epidemic. But these crises can generate feelings of guilt, self-alienation, struggle, frustration, there are more words, for students. And even sometimes, as we're seeing in our research, for the teacher. So typically, Jacek suggests transformative learning might have more than an epistemic or a pedagogic intent. It probably also has a moral intent. And if we think where it's come from, then this is not surprising. So we probably need to ask the question, does the end justify the means? We would argue that transformative learning sets up an educational dilemma. and a paradox in moral education. How do we sell it to our students? That it leads to experiences that can be valued because they promise to reveal deep facts about the human condition. Is that what we offer our students? That it works towards personally meaningful and socially beneficial ends? So we need to think about what sits beneath this pedagogic approach if we do want to draw on it. So who should be making it happen? Well, we argued in the symposium that the connection between the personal and the social should move to the organizational. And Tina argued very strongly for the organizational role, that our institutions need to be taking on this idea of challenging hegemonic thinking. So transformative principles, says Nielsen, that focus solely on the individual present limitations, especially in the presence of high power stratifications, such as we see at our universities. And then we can go back, close the loop to Frank and Chen, the Lancet article from 2010, and we see that already at this time, they were suggesting that there needs to be institutional engagements to mobilize the sort of leadership that would lead to transformative learning. So transforming leaders then become important in this process. To gain true organizational change, we must deal with the fundamental identity, values, and culture of organization. So the picture we can see starts getting bigger and bigger. And to transform organizations, says Nielsen, well, we need to recognize the challenges, that which makes change difficult in the first place. Tina, drawing on Nielsen's work, argued that we need to work within the culture towards an institutional paradigm shift, while we're still acknowledging the value of the individual. And foster transformational learning and organizational change together so that we focus on this interconnectedness. So I'm coming to the end. How will we know it has worked? Well, at the moment, the jury's still out as far as that question is concerned. We have many, many pages of evidence of students who have used words that resonate with the way in which transformative learning is defined. Students who say that as a result of X, Y, and Z, they will never think the same way. They will never practice the same way. But we have no longitudinal studies that have worked with people over periods of time. Ayelet Cooper suggests that this is because the epistemological and ontological basis of the assessments that we use in our programs, or evaluations, if that's the word you use in your context, are still very different from the epistemological assumptions of transformative learning. So we have a disconnect. So people are using, for example, a lot of reflective writing to encourage students to reflect on their thinking and their experiences and why their beliefs have been challenged. But how is that fitting into our assessment processes? So Ayelet argues that these are at the moment still a little far apart. And so there's work that needs to be done. So what is the way forward for us in health professions education? Ayelet has suggested that we need to generate both individualized evidence while considering suitable approaches, and that's specifically talking about in our assessment. She suggests that we might need to define some best practice models and draw more deeply on social science understandings as we embrace critical reflection and critical reflexivity. What do I as a student bring to the learning space? What are the assumptions and preconceived ideas that form my learning? But perhaps then to also recognize the relevance of a pedagogy of place, the importance of the space within which learning is happening, that we acknowledge that the influence of that context has on the individual journey. And surely now in this time of COVID, more than ever, are we realizing how context influences all of our journeys. But if we're talking about our students, their academic experiences, and that we really need to attend to both the cognitive and the affective with the organizational underpinning. But of course, more work is needed. So I'll close with this quote. This comes from our article. We argue that addressing the challenges facing health professions education in this 21st century requires a pedagogy of uncertainty that allows for human flourishing, acknowledging the complexity of the world that we live in, and questioning what we believe we know about it. And we would argue that transformative learning theory, with all the caveats, with all the uncertainty, offers maybe one such pedagogy. So thanks everyone, and Elsie's going to take over now and field the questions or manage the questions.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that illuminating presentation. Very thought-provoking. Thank you very much, and very clearly presented. So we have some questions and comments in the chat box. Please feel free to use the chat box. That's where we are following. We'll be following them there. I will start off with my own, Susan. As educators, we find ourselves presented with the curriculum, and we are supposed to evaluate this curriculum or implement them. And always the question is asked, is this transformative? Is it going to be transformative for the students? And we know that this theory is not static. There's change, but here you have a static document. So what would you think, what are the things that you'd look at as an educator evaluating a curriculum that could inform you that probably this could be transformative?
Yes, thanks, Elsie. I think, again, the study that we've embarked on now here in South Africa, we're doing a 5-year study like the MEPI study was, and across a number of different health sciences faculties in South Africa, and the project is called Responsive Curricula. And our point of departure is that the curriculum is just the blueprint. So I think people are writing really good curricula. And when I'm talking about the curriculum, it's much bigger than, of course, the content. I mean, the content, there is a core canon of knowledge that a physiotherapist, a radiologist, a speech language hearing therapist, a medical doctor, there's a canon that they need to know. But increasingly, we're seeing that curricula are being situated within these ideas, different ideas. You can go onto any university's website and they're there in the mission statement. We're going to be this for society and that for society. You can write that into the curriculum, but that's just the blueprint. The issue is, how are people, the people who are responsible for implementing that curriculum, how are they going to respond? What are they going to take out of the curriculum? So that's a long answer to really saying, yes, there are things that you can look at, you can evaluate the curriculum, and you can say, they're making all the right noises. It's got everything that we need. But it's a tool in the hand of the teacher and the institution, and of course the student and the environment. All those things come into play to give life, to breathe life into the curriculum. So I think we need to be doing a lot more work with faculty and having these conversations with faculty.
Thank you very much. And from Roy Mubuke, how can educators apply principles of transformative learning theory into their routine teaching and learning activities?
So, Buki, I can't speak to your specific discipline, But I think if I can, I mean, I'm an educationalist. So when I work with my master's students, they typically all come from a teaching context. So let me share something from that background. When you are engaged with a particular topic, let's talk about assessment. Now, typically you would engage around the principles of sound assessment, you know, validity and reliability and trustworthiness and feasibility and all those sorts of terms. But then in the classroom, when you get the students to look at those principles, you understand, what does that look like in your classroom? Challenge them. What will fairness look like in your classroom? Let's think now with all the online learning, how fair is assessment at the moment? That's perhaps got nothing to do with content, but all about the social realities with which many of our students have to cope with at this time. So embarking on that sort of conversation in the classroom, while you are busy with the canon, while you are busy with the core content, infuses a different conversation and creates opportunities for, well, first the students hear it, and then you need to take it forward in encouraging with, for example, reflective writing, portfolios, a debriefing, critical feedback, peer engagement. All those things create opportunities for people to actually not only inscribe, but also embody these understandings. I hope that helps, Roy.
Okay, so from Joe Collars, great work, Susan. Thank you. At one point in the learning journey, should ideas of transformative learning be introduced? At what point? Is this more for advanced learners, or should it be introduced earlier in the school process?
So, Joe, yeah, really good question. If we remember that Meserov, when he, you know, his idea behind the theory was very emphatically an adult learning theory. So, you know, when are people regarded as adults, and what would be the requirement for that? Yeah, I mean, it's probably not something that's seen much in the literature about schooling, but the moment you're at a higher education level, I think our young people are already showing that they can have very strong opinions and very strong ideas about things. So the sooner one can expose them to just thinking about their ideas and thinking about whether their ideas are more relevant than someone else's. So I think, Joe, my answer to you would be that when we get into higher education, I think we need to start opening up these conversations. But it goes back to what are all of you saying in your program curriculum documents? What claims are we making? If you're drawing on CanMeds, for example, CanMeds argues that one of the attributes, one of the roles is that of advocate. So if we're saying that we want students to be advocates for health, well, what will that advocacy look like? And how are they entering into that advocacy debate? So I'm not saying that as teachers we need to tell them how they should be entering it, but we need to make them aware of the fact that they, if we're expecting them to be advocates, they will be entering the debate as advocates from a particular perspective. And do they know what that is? And do they know what it implies?
Thank you, Suzanne. So the next one is from Marieke de Villiers. How do we reconcile the individual experiencing the disorienting dilemma with the community of learners doing the same?
Marieke, I'm not entirely sure I understand your question. Do you want to give me another prompt?
Marieke, you could add on something?
Yes, Susan, there's emphasis on the individual experience in a disorienting dilemma.
Yeah.
But I feel we also need to acknowledge the value of the community experience. How do students as a community experience, say, the COVID situation?
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I mean, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I think that's what Tina was also alluding to. She actually took it another level up in terms of the institution. But I definitely think that there are layers. I suspect that, I mean, if you read Meserov's original work, it was looking at changing the thinking at the level of the individual. But obviously, we know that a group of individuals who start challenging hegemonic ideas, a specific way of doing, a specific way of being, then that just becomes even more powerful. But it could also be more debilitating. And that's where Jacek's work is so interesting, because warning us to be careful, and us now as teachers to be careful of what is happening in the mind and the psyche of the students. And Marika, you're absolutely right. You know, wow, what lies ahead for us in health professions education after when this pandemic eventually passes. There's going to be a lot of work that will need to be done.
Thank you. Then another one from Care Council. Sorry, just a minute. It says, how then will transformative education impact assessment? Both students and teachers will need to be transparently comfortable in knowing that they are ever learning from each other and the environment.
Oh, that is beautiful, Kakanse. Yes. And I think, I mean, wouldn't that be amazing if we can be really comfortable knowing that we are learning from each other and from the environment? I mean, that's one of the hardest things often, is to acknowledge that you don't know it all. I remember as a young teacher, that was my biggest fear, that the students would ask me something I didn't have the answer for. Now I love it. That's the best part in the class. Let's find out together what's happening here. So that's a lovely statement. How will it impact assessment? Well, it's very important to remember that this is not an either-or situation. So the canon remains. The canon of knowledge remains. But this is other knowledge. People often talk about soft skills and those, it's not that. Knowing yourself is as important knowledge as knowing the bones in the hand. Sorry, I'm not a clinician, so I'll use an example I'm safe with. Those types of knowledge are equally important. Our challenge then becomes, how do we assess both, which is what Kakanse is asking here. How will it affect assessment? And that's what Ayelet Cooper, she's actually working with a team of researchers at the moment, where they're doing another scoping review specifically at assessment and transformative learning. That work hasn't come out yet, because I know Ayelet has been really on the front line with COVID, but I'm sure it's going to come out soon. And that really, those are the key questions. How are we going to make this count so that we can shift the thinking? Because many of our students are still only concerned about what will the mark be at the end. And so how do we shift that? How do we find approaches to assessment that enable students to demonstrate that different thinking? And that comes back to Joe's question, really, because as our students get more senior, it becomes easier to do portfolio type assessments and more reflective assessments, often because the numbers get fewer.
Okay, so Faith Nawad is asking, how much time is required to measure transformative education? I mean, how long would it take for one to be able to measure the fact that transformative learning has had an effect on a student?
So again, I think that links back to a bit to the previous question. How long is a piece of string? If you think of yourself, there will have been moments in your life similar to threshold concepts where you actually absolutely knew that now you understand something differently. And there have been other instances in your life where it's taken time and spade work to really grapple with something until you eventually think, okay, now I've made sense of it. And now I can work with this different set of ideas. So I think it's a difficult question. I think that's one of the challenges with this approach, is that it is complex and it defies being put in a box. And it's not something that should be seen as being able to exist on its own. I would argue that transformative learning is a necessary but not sufficient condition for learning. I think that's how I would sum it up. So, even as I've moved on into other research, I'm realizing that transformative learning was such an important springboard in terms of a theoretical understanding, but it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for real knowledge construction and for really moving forward with all of these ideas.
Okay, so Bill Burdick has put some things to consider in the chat box and some references. Please have a look at the chat box, and we'll have these on our blog later. Please have a look at them. Then we have Rebecca Nekeka saying, how possible is it to apply principles of transformative learning given the big numbers of students in our classes? That's a real challenge, especially in our region in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. So Rebecca, I feel your pain. The thing is if we start looking at transformative learning pedagogy, what we can do, then having conversations with large groups of students is not that complicated if we can find ways. Look, a very big class is nothing other than a whole lot of small groups sitting in the same room. And so how do we find ways to moderate and mediate that? But one of the challenges relates to the assessment of such large groups. So people who, for example, encourage students to do reflective portfolios have found, if you're doing reflective portfolios with 300 students, that is quite difficult to manage. But starting the conversation that is carried through the curriculum over the 4, 5, 6 years that the students are at the university, if we start thinking about threading through the principles of programmatic assessment and pulling it through, then you see the potential for those sorts of opportunities, even with large groups. And I just have to say to Bill, Parker Palmer, Courage to Teach, he's one of my favorites. So yeah, thank you for that. I see Bill has his hand up.
It's all about process. Transformative learning is not a thing as much as it is a process. And Parker Palmer really teaches us that point. The teacher creates the environment in which students are willing to question. And I think that concept of bringing our faculty along to that point where they're willing to embrace uncertainty, where they're willing to hold an environment that promotes and nurtures deeper questioning, that's really the key. And in that sense, Marimanakis is right, it's dangerous. And if you're not willing to hold that danger, then this is probably not for you. And as far as selling it to students, if the assessments, if the way students are graded is aligned with these bigger concepts of knowledge advancement, knowledge in quotes, then the students will buy it. It's when we continue to have assessments that are based on what you rightly said, Susan, is the canon of knowledge, which is essential, But when the assessment is only on that canon of knowledge and not on these deeper issues, students are frustrated and they're angry because we are, quote, wasting their time.
Thank you, Bill. I'm sorry we have to stop there, and I would like to thank Susan so much for this presentation and all the thoughts that she has put into this, and all of you who have asked questions and put comments. Thank you very, very much, Susan. We really appreciate this. And I would like to appreciate all of you who have been on this webinar. Thank you so much for coming. For the rest of the comments and the questions, we'll put them on our blog on the AFREhealth website, and we'll send them to Susan, and she'll be able to reply and give you a response. And you can get her email and continue chatting about this with her. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice day, afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are.
Great job, Susan.
We would like to thank AFREhealth for giving us the platform to do this.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Any last comments, Susan?
Stay safe. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.